Welcome to the Jeffrey van Leeuwen podcast, episode 13. In this episode, I'll be talking with Magnus Lomax Bjerke. Magnus is a public speaker and improv theater teacher and talks about how he grew up on the water and what it means for him to go on adventure. He's aspiring to sail around the world as the ultimate adventure of play and loves the art of learning new languages, and aside from speaking Norwegian and English, he's also fluent in Chinese Mandarin and is self-learning Spanish, German and French. In this conversation, we talk about the art of language learning, what it means to study and live in China, and we delve into the world of improv theater. And considering that Magnus is engaged in stand-up comedy, this episode is plenty funny, so I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the Jeffrey van Leeuwen podcast, please consider subscribing or following on Spotify, Apple Podcast and YouTube. Leaving a comment or a positive review is also a great way to help out. And now, with that out of the way, here is Magnus Lomax Bjerke. So, one of the things that instantly stood out to me when looking into your background was at least to me, the very unconventional setting that you grew up in. So you mentioned in one of your recent videos on YouTube, where you post some lectures of your, let's call it your adventures, that you have a very practical relationship with the Norwegian fjords and that you grew up on a 60-foot sailing ship. And this sounds to me, who grew up in a completely different environment, to be an incredibly beautiful and interesting way to grow up in, with stunning landscapes pretty much everywhere that you look and perhaps all sorts of adventures waiting for you. Can you take me back to that time and tell me how it was growing up in that environment?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for noting that. So you must then have found a lecture I do. So I just mentioned that. So I work as a lecturer on a Norwegian sort of institution, you could say. It's basically a cruise ship company called Hurtigruta, which used to be like the way that Norwegians would travel from port to port to get up to northern Norway. But now it's become like this sort of iconic fjord cruise for people from all over the world. So my job is to basically, I'm the edutainment, to give people lectures on anything that has anything to do with Norway, kind of thing. Which then, of course, includes the fjords. So I do one about fjords. I had to learn a bit about Norwegian geology. But then that is something that is very, very close to my heart. So yeah, as you say, I come from a family of sailors. That's pretty much how my parents met. My dad, he just does anything that has to do with sailboats. That's been his entire life. He sort of never had a job. He just sails boats, basically. And then he met my mother when she was cruising in the Caribbean with her parents. And then when they started a family, they decided to go back to Norway. And then our family home was this 60-foot whaler, actually. So actually not a sailboat, but an old like wooden boat. So my earliest memories are like, basically the smell of like old rope and tar and diesel. That brings me sort of straight back to my earliest memories. So we lived there until I was about 5 years old. But then we've always like had family holidays on sailboats, and that's sort of what we do. And that always seemed very normal to me. So like when I was 5 years old, my parents took my brother and I out of school for like 4 months, and we crossed the Atlantic on this old sailboat, and then we just cruised around in the Caribbean for, a few months, which again seemed like a sort of completely normal thing to do.
So if the sailboat would be stationary, or that you would actually be moving, but you crossed pretty much the whole world with that thing.
Well, yeah, so that was just a sailboat that my dad was sailing as like a delivery job, because that's a whole business in yachting, which is delivery. So people who want to do a season, let's say in the Mediterranean or something, but their boat happens to be on the other side of the Atlantic, it's a bit of a hassle to sail it yourself if you don't have the time. So then you basically call my dad, and then he sails it over for you. So also growing up, I would come along for a lot of those jobs. So basically, sailing from A to B.
Right. Yeah, right. But you mentioned, so let me get this straight. You mentioned that you lived on that first boat until you were 5, and then you moved. Did you move to the land after that, or did you stay on a different ship?
Now then we moved on land. Exactly. It was
Oh,
basically
okay.
my mother realized she needed a bit more space. 2 kids, 1 dog. So that then it's hard to squeeze everything into a little boat. And she was kind of sick of coming home and then her home being like away. If my dad would have timed things badly and taken the boat out. So living on a boat, it's like a special lifestyle. I've done it myself since. We have like family sailboats. I've been looking after my grandmother's sailboat. So I did like a year, maybe 5 years ago, where I lived a year on the boat. And living in Norway, that's beautiful for the summer months, but kind of tricky when you get into the longer, cold winter times.
Tricky because it freezes.
Oh, well, it's just freezing cold. I mean, you need, you can insulate. You put like the glava, insulation on deck. The snow insulates a bit. But then, I mean, it's a small boat. You could barely stand, or I can't stand upright inside. So, going in and out, you're getting snow in and everything. So it's a whole thing. It's cozy though. I'll give you that.
Is like the boat itself well insulated? Do you have like double glass and is like everything airtight, or is it more like
no. It's rubbish. Okay. You need to do a lot of work to just manage to insulate it, which is why few people can sort of handle the winter season. You can actually find people who own boats, they will rent them out in the winter season because they don't use them. So you can get like a very cheap apartment, like center of Oslo, if you're willing to only live there from, for like 4 or 5 months in the winter. So welcome. If anyone wants a winter in Oslo, you can get yourself a cheap cold accommodation.
Yeah, I can imagine if you're not prepared for that sort of thing, that might turn into a big problem for you once you're actually there.
Yeah.
Right.
But you're from the Netherlands, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Do you have any relationship with river boats, boat houses? That's like a huge thing, right? I've been to Amsterdam a couple of times. It seems like the most romantic thing in the world.
Well, then you have seen a couple of the Dutch word would be a woonboot, which is a living boat, I suppose you could translate it to. They're in the canals, they're in the rivers, and I'm from a town myself, Delft, which is in South Holland, which is ironically not in the south of the Netherlands, it's in the west of Netherlands.
Delft is gorgeous.
It is a beautiful town, for sure.
Yeah, famous for your porcelain, right?
You're absolutely right. So Delft, one of the things that Delft is famous for is indeed the Delft's blue porcelain. It's quite fun, but yeah, Delft is also a town that was originally, I believe, when it was smaller, back when it was a city-state, it was surrounded by water and a couple of towers, and these big walls with these holes for cannons and those kind of things. And these waters actually connect to the nearby, I'm not sure if you could call them rivers, but for now, for the sake of the story, let's just call them rivers. And those rivers are full with these living boats, and they're quite a bit of them, and people generally seem to be enjoying them. I've never lived on one myself, though. I don't think I've ever been on one to begin with, not on a living boat at least.
They're really cool. I had one of my favorite family holidays growing up. That was on a riverboat holiday in England through the English channels. That's like tiny dream to live on a riverboat.
You seem to be very connected to living on boats.
Something about it, man. I was so close to quit everything and decide to sail around the Caribbean for 6 months recently, because I had a friend who had a bit of time. I was basically looking for an excuse to take a bit of time, and he had a boat, but we ended up not really having enough time to plan it properly. But still, a around the world sailing trip is somewhere in the mix at some point. I feel like it should happen.
Is that gonna be something in like the next couple of years, or is it more down the line when you're in your 40s or in your 50s or something like that?
Ooh, no, that's hard to say. But if you're gonna do it justice, if you're gonna sail around the world, you need like 4 years. If you're gonna plan just to hit all like the seasons, the trade winds properly, and if you want to have a little bit of time, then apparently 4 years. That's that's the way to go.
Didn't that, I forgot what her name is, but there was this young girl. She was 15 or 16 years old or something like that. And that was what was her name?
The Australian girl. I forget her name, but they made a movie, right? I think I watched that last year.
I think so.
Drama.
Yeah.
Yeah,
she was quite famous a couple of years ago.
Yeah, sailing non-stop solo around the world. That's crazy.
I think she was even younger. I think she was like 13 or 14 or something like that.
Something like that.
Insane age. And all by herself, right?
Yeah, completely by herself. I mean, that's a good move by the parents. You know, that's like, isn't that the worst time to have a teenager at home? Just send them out on a boat at sea. Deal with that issue. Mother Nature will take care of the schooling now.
Yeah, I guess so.
Raising kids on a boat.
That might have been the reason for it.
I've met some people, but I met some people who went out. They sold everything to go sailing around the world, and then they ended up having 3 children like along the way, and coming back home. The eldest was by that time like 5 years old, and then they had a 2-year-old and a baby. And these kids, all they've ever known is just, you know, the insides of a 40-foot sailboat. Just sailing around the world.
That's insane.
Must be like
what does it take to
quite an
make a
amazing
decision
way
like that?
To grow up.
Yeah, I really wonder what does it take to make a decision like that? What goes in it? What do you need to do? How do you prepare for something like that?
Well, I spoke to these parents, and they set out. I think they had, and most people do have, a sort of moment of saying, "Screw it," you know. We've been doing the whole corporate job thing. It's not going where we want to go. It's a bit of a sort of middle finger to the sort of general society, I guess, like the expectations of how you're supposed to be a family. So they just sold everything they had, and then they bought a boat, and they had enough to sort of keep themselves afloat for a year. And then you stop and do like odd jobs here and there. But definitely, I think, escaping from something sometimes. I've spoken to several people who set out for one of these trips, and it's always like the idea that you think you're going to find something floating out at sea, but yeah, you probably realize that your problems follow you wherever you're going.
I can't even imagine it, to leave everything behind like that for such a long time. Your family and mostly your family, I suppose, your friends.
Yeah, but it helps to make a new one, I guess, when you're out there.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. You're definitely gonna meet a lot of new people. Well, sure, on the land, of course.
So speaking of meeting new people, I asked you a little bit earlier, but what's been your what have you learned from doing this now? You've done almost 10 episodes. Has it been what you expected? That's one thing. I can imagine. Just you're already part of the 1% of podcasts that make it over like 8 episones or something. 0.1%. So congratulations with that. I think that's literally a thing.
Thank you.
As someone who has tried to start 2 podcasts before, I can personally attest that there is such a thing as having recorded 3 and then somehow not making it to continue.
Right. Why did it discontinue for you? What did you encounter?
One thing, because it was a project with a good friend of mine. So we viewed it as like something we could do together. So then just being able to find the time with two people turns out to be exponentially harder than if you're just one, I think. That's at least part of my excuse. And just like small stuff, like thinking you need to plan and have a lot of the right equipment and shit like that. Yeah. No, I'm really good at making podcast ideas, which I think there are many of us out in the world. So I'm always very impressed by people who can get the plan properly through.
It's definitely a lot more work than I originally expected it to be. The original idea was, okay, you need to... Actually, I didn't even... Because right now we're using a platform called Riverside, which takes care of a lot of the technicalities. So I don't have to mess around, for example, with having multiple audio streams and then muting one stream or the other in order to make it more fluent. The platform takes care of that. And the original idea was, and that's also how I pitched it back then with Marine, who was the first guest. It's like, hey, I will record the conversation on my side with my phone, for example, and you will record the conversation on your side with your phone. Then after the conversation, you hand me over the audio file from your side, and I will, with a program, I will combine them into one track, which I thought was a really good idea back then. Luckily, I found Riverside, and in hindsight, I'm quite happy about that.
Yeah,
because the amount of work is insane.
Yeah, you would imagine that there is by now some good software. I mean, this seems to be a lifesaver then, if it takes care of everything.
Yeah, for sure. It doesn't do everything, so it's very good at it's very good at making the conversation fluent. So if there's, for example, a lot of breaks or something like that, or there's a lot of thinking or a lot of those sounds, it's good at filtering those out to make the conversation more appealing, I suppose. But it's not perfect at that, and you will notice in the end that that cuts are happening on places where they shouldn't happen, and they break sentences in half, for example. So still, I go from start to finish. I go through the conversation each and every time. And usually what I found is that every second I record takes around 3 seconds to review. So with a conversation that is, let's say, 2 hours, it takes me around 5 to 6 hours to make that conversation ready to publish. And then you record the intro, you record the outro, you make the visuals for it, and also the researching before the episode, of course, happens. So I think all in all per episode, it's like a time investment for 2 hour conversation, I think, like plus minus 10 hours, something like that, maybe.
Ooh.
It really depends on the episode.
Well, hey, thank you for your service. I'm going to keep this super short and sweet for you too.
No, absolutely. It's an absolute pleasure. So this is, to be clear, this is not me complaining. I absolutely love to do it. It's really, really fun.
I understand 100%. But yeah, just I can appreciate how certainly, and also like a learning curve in the beginning as well. Things might take more time than you think.
Yes.
So I just want to be completely upfront with this, that my reasons for coming on are very, very selfish, because I just want to, a year from now, say that I was on the same podcast where hotshot guests like Jordan Peterson were and stuff like that. I think that's going to happen, Jeffrey, if you keep this up. Have you thought about this? You know what you're doing. There are going to be some crazy names here if you just keep doing this.
Maybe. I don't know.
Guest number now, 50. Yeah.
Yeah, guest number 50.
Who's your like, if you were to indulge yourself a bit, who would be like what's your God tier 3 guests to have on your podcast?
My God tier 3 guests to have on the podcast.
Yeah.
To be quite honest, and this is not me trying to weasel my way out of this question, but to be quite honest, I haven't even thought about it. Right now, I'm focusing on getting as many people as I can from the academy onto the podcast to just hear the stories, because I want to know what kind of people the academy attracts, what made them who they are, what they're good in, what their expertises are, and to just hear their stories. And quite a bit of beautiful stories came out of that. I mean, marine story from South Africa, and this is not in the podcast, but we spoke a little bit about the history of South Africa, for example, after the podcast. It was a very short podcast in hindsight. It should have been longer, but it was the first one that I made. But anyway, regardless, her story about that, and for example, Adam's story as a psychoanalyst, and even the episode that got published yesterday. So we are right now recording on 30 October. And the podcast that got published yesterday was the one with Mara. Amazing story. It really fun to listen to. It's so completely outside of my own experience that is, to me personally, is really interesting to explore with people. So to be honest, I don't know. I don't really have a. If I would speculate, I mean, it really depends. I think it will be very fun to, at some point, have people on that are different than the people I spoke to so far, and not just different just different in general. So not really politically. I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for it, because the amount of people that are coming in are very diverse already. They're coming from all over the world with all kinds of different stories.
Yeah, no, and I like this answer really, because I can imagine you wouldn't have been able to like predict who's going to come on or like what kind of people there are. So you have this. I mean, we've made that connection on the Peterson Academy platform, right? Which is this weird upstart social platform. It's fascinating to see it sort of growing in real time with all the different, discussions going on, the people who are there. So just having this pool of people to just explore. I mean, it's interesting for us listening to see, who are the people who are here. But also just for you, I can imagine it's a bit of an adventure just to find out who on earth shows up.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially because we are dealing with people that, generally speaking, are aiming up and aiming to become better versions of themselves, which automatically, to me at least, makes them incredibly interesting. Because the reason why they're doing that is because there's an underlying experience that drives that. There's a reason why they want to improve, why they want to be better. And what I'm really curious in is, what is that reason? What is driving them? Where is that ambition coming from? Where is that need to be good for your environment coming from exactly? Because it's very easy also to go the other side. And I mean, not everybody in the world made the conclusion that aiming up is the best way forward. So it's not obvious at all that is the default mindset that people have. And I think that people that have that mindset and that came to that conclusion, generally speaking, there's a story behind there, and I'm really interested to hear that story.
Yeah, it'll be. How many people have you had reaching out to you to wanna speak? Did you have like a long log, you could say?
It trickles in.
Yeah.
So 10 episodes have been published, 12 have been recorded. This is number 13 that we're doing right now. Assuming that it will be published as 13, those numbers can change a little bit. It depends on a couple of things. But regardless, this is conversation number 13. And I think I will have to check it out, but I think 4 or 5 have been actively planned over the next couple of weeks. And I believe I have a couple in my backlog, and also a couple of people that already had an episode recorded and would like to come back on with a couple of interesting topics. So yeah, there should be more than enough to fill up the rest of the year, at least.
Awesome. Many 10-hour sessions for you to look forward to.
It's a pleasure. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, amazing.
For sure. But you said you had 2 podcasts, right? So both you felt that you were part of the 99% that didn't reach the 8 episodes? Was it in both situations?
Both situations, yeah. Just sort of starting up, managed to record a few podcasts, but then I don't think we got past the publishing hurdle on any of them. was still kind of fun to publish though. But they were great ideas. One of them was in Chinese, actually.
Really?
Yeah, because that's yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about sort of language learning and stuff. So Chinese has been
Mm-hmm.
sort of my main language of focus for the past 8 years or something. But anyone who's tried to learn a language will know that you get to a point where you struggle to find ways of practicing if you're not in the country, if you don't have like specific places to be. You need output opportunities. So a friend of mine and I, we figured it would be good to just sit down in front of a mic a couple of times a week to chat shit in Chinese, basically, which was kind of fun. It wasn't sustainable as a project for whatever reason, but yeah.
So, believe it or not, but I don't speak Chinese. But I've seen your video
What?
where you did. Yeah, I know. But you did a video. I saw it a couple of hours ago where you were. I think it was a comedy show that you did in front of a bunch of Chinese people, and to me it sounded incredibly fluent what you were saying, and you actually got a couple of laughs out of them.
Yeah, that was for Chinese New Year's celebration in Oslo. So
Mm.
after I'd been learning for a couple of years, I'd lived a couple of years in China, came back to Norway, and then someone sort of knew that I was a guy who likes to be on stage who speaks Chinese. So they asked me to host it. So that was the first time. Now I've hosted like the Oslo Chinese New Year's celebration quite a few times. But this was like a big deal. They'd flown in loads of artists from China, and then it was going to be televised, and it was like quite a big thing. And they asked if I wanted to do something else, and I'd always wanted to try stand up. So I basically just
Mm.
asked if I could have a little stand up routine. And they, for some reason, said, "Sure, that sounds like a brilliant idea." So then all of a sudden I had to come up with a 10-minute stand-up routine. And calling it stand-up was almost kind of a stretch. I mean, that was the format, but it was a very nice audience. And at this point, they're just, they're laughing and clapping just because there's a white guy speaking Chinese. So you've laid the bar very, very low.
Mm.
Which is actually a bit of a pro tip. Actually, I actually wrote a little essay that I published today, which I called "Talking about the duck on a skateboard effect." Have you heard about the duck on a skateboard?
The duck on a skateboard effect. No, I haven't heard of that. What is that?
Yes, I'm well, big into improvisational theater, and people. Sometimes people are very impressed with improv theater in the same way that you're impressed if you see a duck skateboarding. You're just very, very surprised that such a thing is possible, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So people go to an improv show and they don't really care if anything is very funny or if there are good stories and good actors, like quality on stage. Just the fact that people are doing things without having planned, that's enough. So that's like... then it's just you're just there for the spectacle. And that's kind of what I've done in a lot of Chinese things. So people just think the fact that you're doing this in Chinese, you've already won. And then you're sort of making it very easy for yourself to win. So I've done that with like joint debate competitions, and I found debating to be very, very intimidating. So I've never like done it properly in in my mother tongue. But I managed to sort of lure myself into it in Chinese, because then I didn't feel like it was as dangerous, because I was like, I've already just done something cool in Chinese. So
Is this part of your... So one of your interests seem to be learning languages, and Chinese seems to be on the forefront of that. So aside from your mother tongue, Norwegian, is seeking these challenges, because debating is, well, I don't think there's a bigger challenge than that for your language learning process. Is that one of the things that you do in order to learn a language quicker?
well, specifically Well, yeah, debating was kind of extreme just because it is something that I've found very intimidating and it is hard.
Mm-hmm.
But generally, just setting yourself some kind of slightly weird challenge that seems quite a lot outside your comfort zone, that is like very important, I think, because otherwise it's very hard to sort of measure how you're doing. But if you give yourself a challenge like that, then all of a sudden, the amount of focus you get is insane, because your entire nervous system is telling you what is relevant, what isn't relevant, and then you need to rehearse for that one thing. So debate is one thing. Having to prepare a stand-up routine, then you know that you have to be on stage and you have to be doing this thing at a certain point. So then everything that's not relevant to that just is completely uninteresting at that point. So it's a general good tool for learning anything, I'd say, is just to give yourself some challenge to help you focus, but also to make the challenge so big that even if you fail, basically so big that you can't fail. You want to make it so big that even failing would be considered a win just because you've tried to do the thing, if you get what I mean.
There's no such thing as losing, there's just winning or learning.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So then you might as well try to learn bigly. So you want to make the goal slightly weird, or that's at least been my approach to try and make it a weird goal, because then also not as many people are doing it. So you basically dodge competition in a way.
Mm-hmm. So I can assume a little bit where your interest in languages is coming from, and I'm just gonna summarize something for you, and let me know if I got this right. So you grew up on the water, and you have parents that have been traveling the world, and you also have aspirations to also travel the world. So you are clearly a person that has an interest in not just staying in one place, not just staying in one country. Languages, for obvious reasons, go hand in hand with that, because then you can communicate in way more regions in the world. So automatically it also means that that you have a lot of interest in cultures in general. My question would be, why Chinese? Why specifically China? I'm not sure, you didn't say that China as a country is of interest to you, but Chinese as a language and maybe China as a culture. Why is that on the forefront for you?
Well, it certainly is. It certainly is both.
Mm-hmm.
The easy, there's like a pragmatic reason, which would be, as I was growing up, I was starting to have a greater interest in, the world, trying to understand the big issues and what's going on. And then I sort of stumbled upon this whole, ancient culture, which had dominated the East for most of history, which I just find to be sort of inherently interesting, that there's this whole sort of history that I personally didn't know anything about. So I started learning about that, and then you also see, people say China's going to be more important. China's a up and rising place. If you view that as then a big threat or a potential, it seemed to be a big deal. So I basically pragmatically figured, because I studied, I basically sort of made my own bachelor's degree, you could say. But it was sort of around Chinese studies, because then I could do Chinese language. Mm-hmm. So I studied Chinese language for 1 year at university, and then I just did a lot of exchanges. So I lived a year in Taiwan, and then a year in Shanghai, and then moving around. So it was like this idea that to have a bit of China specialization would be pragmatically useful, And then as far as the language side was concerned, I basically always heard that Chinese is the hardest language in the world. That's sort of, whether that's true or not is a different question, but that's what people say. So I basically figured I wanted the biggest challenge I could get linguistically, and at the same time have that slightly sort of pragmatic approach that this might come in handy sometime. That's sort of what sparked it. The other reason why Chinese is basically because I always wanted to learn Japanese, and I was a super anime manga nerd growing up. Spent so much time watching these, Japanese culture. I'm sure many people can relate. I'd heard a lot of Japanese language, very much into the martial arts and everything, but it seemed like just a little bit too nerdy to study Japanese. So then Chinese was like, at least there, people seem to say that, this could be useful for something. So I'm still actually just waiting until I have the guts to go full nerd and go study sword fighting in Japan or something like that.
Right. Spend a day with the samurais.
Yes, that's what it's all about.
That's really funny, because I can definitely relate to that as a kid, and I never went ahead with it, just like you. But as a kid, I was also really interested in learning Japanese for the exact same reasons. So big video gamer, big anime fan. So yeah, those two combined are a very good reason to start learning Japanese. But never went ahead with it. But it's funny what you're saying about the Chinese language, because the same narrative I also heard as a kid. And I remember, and I'm not really sure if she went ahead with this, but I remember my mother also being in the process of starting to learn Chinese. And this was probably something like 15 years ago. But she was in the process of starting to learn it, or at least looking into it. Because there was this idea that at some point China would become the dominant, how would you say that? The dominant country economically, like what the United States has been for the last, I don't know how long, or last 100 years or something like that. Which was a big reason for a lot of people to get interested in Chinese. So that's funny that also was for you one of the reasons to get involved in that.
Well, it was sort of the brainy reason, right? And I just wanted, I was just interested in studying sort of, very macro level world history, stuff like that, international relations, sort of viewing the problems in the world as being, everyone seems to say that there are world issues, so therefore we should try to understand world issues, and then maybe you'll figure out how to solve them. That kind of approach. And then China seemed like a big deal. Yeah, it's like this pragmatic approach. But today, I tell everything I would tell myself sort of as a kid as well, or just when I was younger, that you should look away completely from the pragmatic aspect of it. I mean, if you're trying to learn a language for that kind of reason, because you're looking into the tea leaves as to what might be of use 10 years down the road, then your sort of perspective is kind of off. So you need to find whatever can, and just, well, one thing is I don't really buy the narrative very much, and if you're just looking to practice the most useful language, then you can sort of stay with English pretty much. I mean, it is the world language. But if something doesn't grip you for some other reason now, then trying to sort of second guess yourself due to what might be good 5 years down the road, I mean, that's just it's not a recipe for very efficient learning.
How did you keep your focus?
I kept my focus just because the process of learning a language that is completely different is incredibly satisfying. It's a bit like how I can imagine people feel when they do math for the love of it, kind of. There's you can observe the texture of your brain changing as you suddenly, you're going from just hearing sounds, and then all of a sudden you're noticing patterns in that chaos, and then you can pick out words, and just that process is kind of intoxicating and was just very powerful with Chinese. And then you have the entire script to get to terms with as well. So I was just grabbed very much by the challenge of it, and because I wanted to, I had this fascination with this country that seemed completely different from anything I knew. So I was gonna go live there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you lived a couple of years in China, you said.
Yeah, I lived 1 year in Taipei, which was just intensive language learning. Mm-hmm. And of course, depending on who I'm speaking to, I sometimes just say easy. Yeah, 2 years in China, because for at least linguistic purposes, in Taiwan, their main language is Mandarin Chinese. Mm-hmm. But I'm a big Taiwan fan as like its own place. It's a really, really beautiful place with incredibly lovely people. So the whole politics of that region now are, obviously a bit scary. But I was there for 1 year in Taiwan, and then Shanghai for a year afterwards. At which point I officially sort of finished Chinese according to what a university degree expects you to do, which mm-hmm. also just shows how sort of useless it is to study a language at university, because that was basically just the beginning, of the language journey.
About your experience in China and about these three regions, so Taiwan and these two cities in China mainland itself, what specific things stayed with you the most? So what parts of the culture resonate with you the most, still to this day?
The thing that resonates with me the most about people in China is a sort of enthusiasm for the small things in life. It's a place that's completely obsessed with food. Everything you're doing is around focused around getting to the next table, and it's a very sort of communal culture in that aspect. So a very mm-hmm. very sort of warm culture, which is different from the more the Norwegian focus on giving each other a lot of space, etc. So that's certainly something that's stayed with me, and they're very enthusiastic about foreigners showing an interest, and then very sort of open to that. You do get some other aspects where people are very nationalist at the moment now, very, very, very proud, and then not that open to foreigners. Mm-hmm. But it's generally a very hospitable culture of inviting guests in and sharing, and which you get many places around the world.
So it's a very small minority, the more nationalistic aspect.
In my experience, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I mean that there's a lot of stuff going on. It's fascinating watching Chinese cinema at the moment, because they're sort of in a place where there's a lot of like military movies coming out, war movies where China's very, the good guy for, world order and all of this stuff. So mm-hmm. It's slightly reminiscent of like American movie in the 80s, perhaps, of a sort of unironic hero. But it's now with the Chinese front and center, so that's sort of interesting development to keep an eye on.
You said the difference between the Norwegian approach of giving each other space compared to the more communal approach that the Chinese people have. would you say that, because I've never been to Norway, so the only reference point I have is with other Western European countries, primarily my own country, Netherlands, and well, maybe I should start with this question. So in Netherlands, for as far as I can feel it, we are more individualistic. So we are career-focused, ambitious people. And of course, we take care of our families. That goes without saying. But generally speaking, we are more focused on ourselves and our careers and those kind of things. Is that also a way to describe your experience in Norway?
Yeah, well, certainly the Norwegian sort of self-image is one of you've got like the extreme individualists with these, polar explorers who've got Nansen and Amundsen, setting out, and it's you against nature, but that's also very balanced with this sort of social democratic view of it's all about the community and people pitching in and taking care of each other, and this idea of janteloven. I don't know if you're familiar with that word. It means no one's better than anyone else, kind of thing, or that you sort of you trim the grass so nothing stands out too much. So the Norway definitely balances these two sort of extremes, I'd say.
Yeah, we have it's a little bit of a weird saying, but we have something like that in Netherlands as well. And it's something along the lines of doe maar normaal, dan doe je al gek genoeg. Which means...
That's a silly language.
Yeah, we have the hard G. We have the hard G, which is a thing that foreigners they notice that most of the time. But anyway, that sentence means something along the lines of just act normal, and then you're already acting crazy enough, which is pretty much kind of, I guess, a version of what you just said. Like, just stay in your lane, just do your thing, provide for your family and for your community, and just be productive, pretty much.
Yeah. No, there's some of that, but then Norway is also very. I mean, it's known for its that Norwegian people, they will on a Friday, everyone will leave the office at 4:00 because that's sort of how it is. No one works overtime, and then you have your all the men take all the parental leave that they can get, and this of course is like so different from modern, let's say, Chinese city culture, where it's all about showing that you can work the longest hours, and you need to sacrifice for the career is extremely important, especially if you're a young guy or so China is definitely like a place of extremes where you have this like extreme capitalist focus, also balanced with these very sort of more communal rituals of hospitality at the same time.
It sounds really much like the problem that they have in Japan, and I know that over there. I don't know it in depth, so I've only seen bits and pieces of it. But I do know that working weeks over there are not 40 hours a week. They might be a lot more, and it's really about proving to your boss that you are very productive. And they even sleep on the job just to prove to their employers that they are dedicated to the job, pretty much. And it sounds to me also like what you're describing about the Chinese. Is that similar, do you think, or is it something different?
Very similar. I mean,
right.
Maybe not as extreme as some of what you see in Japan, but you definitely have similar stuff. But yeah, in Japan, there's this culture of long hours, but then also that it's expected that you go out, like, you socialize with your colleagues as well, and with your boss, and your boss is going to buy you drinks, and you need to be there to show respect, and yeah.
How has it shaped your idea of what work means to begin with for people?
How it's shaped my idea of what work means?
Yeah, so how people approach work, how people think about work.
Yeah. I don't know if my time in China had any real sort of impact on that, but well, I can just say that my approach to work is very much. Well, I like the idea of not quite knowing what I'm going to do the next year, so that you can learn a lot in different jobs, but then also trying to build your own thing. So a bit of a freelance approach to work, which is, I guess, very different from the general Norwegian idea of having your respectable job that you then leave at 4 o'clock, so you can have the long weekend and the sort of predictability that you're supposed to have. But I'm very much focused on trying to build things that don't quite exist yet.
That sounds like the sailor blood in you speaking.
The sailor blood, yeah,
yeah.
Adventure, sailing towards the horizons. Exactly, just going Beautiful. With the flow, man. Yeah, see where the wind is blowing.
Beautiful. It does look like a. Where do you think so? How would China be different if that culture wasn't there? So in the sense of the culture of putting in those amount of hours and showing that amount of dedication. So that parallel that I drew with Japan, for example, that specific aspect of it. How would China look like if that wasn't there?
Oof. I have no idea. It is a strong cultural aspect, right? It's all this focus on working very hard, going through all the proper rites of prestige when it comes to doing well academically, and then you're supposed to get a job and you're supposed to build everything sort of well. I mean, it's something you can track very well, and many different places where Chinese people have traveled through the ages. So how it would be different there without that, I have no idea. But the Chinese have there's a specific culture, especially like a work ethic, which is there. Are you familiar with the work of Thomas Sowell, by the way?
I don't think so.
All right, Thomas Sowell. He's an economist / sort of philosopher, historian guy, but he wrote this trilogy of books, which is basically he focuses on the impact of different, just cultural traits in historical development. I guess you could say it's like the opposite of a sort of Jared Diamond approach, which would be guns, germs, and steel. It's all about geographical determinism kind of thing. And then this is like cultural determinism almost. So he tracks how, for example, the Chinese minorities would do in all the different places that they settle down, and how he at least observes very sort of predictable patterns based on all these different cultural groups. I'm waiting for a Thomas Sowell sort of renaissance in the Peterson Academy community. He's become like there's almost like a meme, which is like read Soul, which is quite popular on the, I guess, political right, at least in the sort of American landscape. He's got quite a lot of sort of economics books, which are quite popular, unknown outside the sort of right-wing places, I guess you could say. Although undeservedly so. This is a genius guy who should be widely known.
Why is he specifically attractive to the right, politically speaking?
Well, because he's a free markets, blunt speaking kind of guy, sort of in the same club as you put people like Milton Friedman, the sort of Chicago School of Economics guys. So he comes specifically from that. So yeah, so that would be why.
I have one last question, so I'm gonna do a couple of steps back to the languages, just to wrap that part up. I have one personal question for you. So, I speak two languages. I speak Dutch and I speak English, but I've been trying, and trying is within air quotes, but I've been trying to get into the language of Polish, and the reason why I've been trying to do that is because my wife is from Poland, so there's a big incentive there to learn Polish. One of the reasons why that is important to learn is because pretty much everybody who's older than 40 in Poland doesn't speak English, because back then, it was part of the Soviet Union back before the Berlin Wall fell, so everybody speaks Russian over there, and everybody who's younger than 40, generally speaking, speaks English. So if I want to talk to my father-in-law or to any part of her family, Polish is the language to know, pretty much. So I have my phone with me with Google Translate on it. That's how we communicate. That's pretty much how it works.
Bardzo dobrze.
Bardzo dobrze.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, jak się masz, yeah.
Jak się masz.
I dated a Polish woman as well at one point.
Really?
Yeah, this is all I knew more at one point.
I'm going to ask you that in a few minutes. But the question I wanted to go to, what I found was not the experience that you described. So what you described is like, learning a new language is like you're rewiring your brain, and all of a sudden it's super interesting, because now all of a sudden you can do a lot more things, and it inspires you almost intrinsically. With me, it was more, it was actually a bother. So Polish is a incredibly hard language that can put certain letters in a specific order that absolutely don't make sense to an English speaker, for example. Like you have a C, a Z, a C, and an H, like directly after each other. Yeah, good luck pronouncing that. It doesn't make any sense. What advice would you give me in this specific situation? Maybe practical advice to attack that challenge, to get into the learning process of learning that language.
All right, brilliant. Okay, so you have a very important extrinsic motivation. I wouldn't necessarily say powerful, because I know a lot of people, they're in a position, where it's like a wife and they feel like they have to learn a language, but for some reason the pull isn't there, even though they rationally know it should be, but for some reason it's not working. It's like enough of an impulse. So first of all, just to know that impulse isn't going to come automatically, right? Especially if it feels like a bit of a chore and everything. So you want to make it as easy as possible. So what you need is to just get an initial map of the language to get you started. So what you want to do is to, now I don't know if you had the opportunity to go to the country, or that might be a bit, But that can also then be almost overwhelming, right? When you suddenly have so many sounds that you don't know what to do with.
Generally in my experience, I try to use the words that I know in a order that I think makes sense, and usually what happens is that Polish people laugh very loud, but Polish people in general are very friendly, so they're pretty cool about it. They help me, and that's pretty much it. But yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, what you first, you want to find whatever situation you can find that's like unintimidating, to sort of bathe in the language. And that could be like watching a television show, just something to get used to the sounds. But as far as getting an initial map, you have a couple of resources that are very good that you can do completely in your own time. I'll mention one, which is called the Michel Thomas method, which is basically just a audio recording, a bit like us now, where you have you're just listening to a teacher and two students, and the two students, they know nothing of the language. This course exists in Polish. I've done a little bit of the Polish course actually, and it is then mainly done in English, where the teacher is feeding certain terms to the students and then letting them try things out, and you're like the third student in that course. So when the teacher asks them to try something, then you press pause and you try first, and then you listen. This isn't ideal just from a technical learning perspective, because you're getting a lot of English at the same time, but it's it sort of lets you experience being able to understand and construct basic sentences at a more and more complex level. So you get like an overview of what the language is about, and you know that you are can easily be in a position where you can use the language. So that gives you like a very good skeleton to build on, basically. And because it's something you just listen to and you can do, you can fit it into a routine where you otherwise would have some like downtime. So this is something I've done for a couple of different languages, purely in like commute time, when I otherwise would be listening to a podcast or something on a bus. Then you can put in your language learning, sort of. So at least just to find places where it doesn't feel like too much of an extra chore, because you're slotting it into time that you would otherwise be sort of using anyway.
And what do you make of tools like Duolingo, for example?
Yeah, any tool that sort of gets you started and can get sort of any interest is good. But in my experience, I've yet to meet anyone who's actually got a lot from Duolingo, because people get really good at doing Duolingo, but it doesn't necessarily seem to translate very well to actually learn speaking or using the language, because you're within like very clear parameters when you're using Duolingo. So I'm way much more fan of some tool to give you that initial map overview of like showing you how you can use a bit of grammar without actually telling you anything about grammar, and then just having a lot of input, and then with a lot of input you're going to recognize patterns and words, and then just find or produce scenarios where you can start speaking from day one, actually. And just, if you can treat it as a game, how much you can fail and seem like a very, very dim-witted baby, then you're on a good path.
Right.
And that's the clue. You gotta be a baby, because everyone's learned at least one language, but they learned it basically as a baby, and that's sort of the stage you have to accept that you're gonna have to go through.
Would this also be, roughly speaking, the process that you would follow? So let's say that you right now make the conclusion that you want to learn, I don't know, Finnish or Russian or something like that. And maybe Russian is a good example, because also the alphabet is completely different. So let's say you go for Russian. How would you approach that challenge? What would like be the order of steps that you take?
Well, pretty much what I said now. Michel Thomas' course, they have one for Russian, which I could then do quite sort of comfortably without changing my daily routine too much within like a month, which is a great way of mapping basic grammar. Spend a weekend learning Cyrillic. I mean, new alphabets aren't that complicated, really. And then just get a lot of input. So in the beginning, when you're at a very low level, it's hard to find interesting input at a level that's okay for you. Although apps and websites like Link, LINGQ, if anyone's interested in some resources, that's a very good one at just getting you loads of input from a complete basic level to the most complicated stuff you could ask for. And then just a lot of input in the beginning, focusing on like core vocab. So the 300 most used words in a language and whatever words happen to be relevant to you in whatever situation you are. And then you have to do a lot of heavy lifting the first couple of months. But then you get to a point where you can, let's say, go on Disney Plus, where they dub all the series to like every single language. I mean, Disney Plus, that's a language learning hack. So I did this with, so I did this with German. So I've been learning German now for 1.5 years. And I basically found a sitcom, How I Met Your Mother, because I've watched it before in English, so I kind of know what's going on. Sitcoms are great because they're 20 minutes. It's not too long. It's very dialogue intensive, and all the things they're talking about are quite simple and repetitive. So then I would just watch an episode of How I Met Your Mother in Deutsch without any lyrics, which is important, just so that you're getting comfortable with not understanding everything and just getting the general gist of it. And then downloading the subtitles afterwards and putting into a reading app, the link, LINGQ, that I mentioned. And then the next day, just reading through the subtitles of the episode you watched, making sure that you understand as much as you can. You can highlight then words you didn't quite know. And then I just repeat that process the next day. So that was like the staple, my sort of daily diet of language learning.
It's a very good way to gamify it as well, because like it's very good. It's very easy to track, because if you take a 20-minute episode and you let's say you get 50% right and 50% wrong, and afterwards you find out that 50% is the number that you got at, because then you double checked everything. Then okay, right, awesome. Do that a couple of more times. What's the percentage then? Is it 60? Is it 70? It's very very good way to track your progress.
And also, it doesn't really feel like you're, because for many people, learning sounds like work. So you want to find ways of making it not work and or not feel like work. So something like watching a series you find kind of interesting. That's the way to do it. You need to just make it interesting. Another thing I've done, I mean, on the Peterson Academy, I've been taking my time with these Nietzsche courses. I don't know if you've done those. You probably have.
I have not. They're still
on
the
you
list.
Have not?
No,
okay.
And to be quite honest, I haven't watched a single lecture in like 3 weeks now. I'm way slower than I expected up front.
No, but good for you. Good for you. I think many people are focusing way too much on quantity over quality time when it comes to these things.
I'm taking my time.
but my goal with German has basically been to be able to engage with Nietzsche in the original language. I'm not quite there, but what I've been doing is I've watched one lecture of the Nietzsche course, and then I've just copied the transcript in English into a translation service. I use DeepL, which is really good. D as in deep, and then L, and then it basically gives me perfect German after 1 second, and then I'm just reading through the transcript of the Nietzsche lecture in German. So then I'm kind of reviewing the material, I'm getting my language practice in, and I kind of feel like I'm one step closer to Nietzsche.
Oh, that's really interesting, actually. So, an idea came forward. I want to share this with you. Maybe this is interesting. So one of the things I found really helpful is to copy the full lecture into ChatGPT and then tell ChatGPT, I want you to behave like you are the lecturer, and I'm going to ask you questions, and I want you to use the following lecture as like the lecture that you have given, something along those lines. What happens then is that you can, once you input all the information, the ChatGPT tells you, okay, you're good to go ahead with your questions. And you ask it questions, and it will use that as it will pretty much act like the actual lecturer in answering your questions. That might be really interesting for you to do as well, to input the in this case the Nietzsche lectures into something like ChatGPT, and then say, okay, I want you to behave like you are either the lecturer, or I want you to behave like Nietzsche himself, and I want you to speak German to me, something along those lines. And then you can have actual conversations with that persona, let's call it.
Yeah, no, that's I mean, that's a brilliant way of engaging with the lecture. I've done I haven't done it exactly like that, but I've played around with just telling ChatGPT, hey, I'm learning German. Please, can you speak basic German to me? And whenever you see I'm making mistakes, you can tell me or something like that. And I mean, this is incredibly exciting stuff. And there are people who've built now, I think Duolingo's incorporating it. I mean, they must. And you have brand new sort of language apps now, which are 100% based on this kind of speaking, which is, I mean, it's a game changer.
It's a beautiful way to learn.
Yeah, I think so. Although it's there is something about that human interaction, if you can get it. It's not always available.
Yes.
Which is interesting because you're learning Polish for your wife or girlfriend, correct?
Wife, yes.
Yes, for your wife. And there, I've experienced or heard from some people who've found it hard when they are trying to get their spouse to help them with the language, because there's such a clear sort of power difference in a way, and well, it's a big ask to ask someone to treat you as a child, right? To help you with the language, and then they might, not want to spend all that effort or something. And then some people don't like to be in the situation where they're obviously the more stupid one, and because they're speaking a brand new language. So sometimes I've heard people who've had big issues with trying to learn a language together with your spouse. I don't know what your experience has been, if that has been a recipe for harmony and good times, or if it's been tricky.
Well, it has been more fun, to be honest, because we are both learning a new language. In my case, it will be Polish, and in her case, it will be Dutch. So we are both stupid in each other's language, pretty much.
Well, that's great. So you can both feel superior on and off.
Yeah, so it has been more playful than serious. I wouldn't say there is something like a power dynamic at play or something like that. It's more, we haven't taken it as serious as maybe we could. Also because the incentive is not really there, and the reason why it's not really there is because we both speak English. So we speak in a combination of Dutch, English, and Polish, and primarily in English with each other. And my family on my side, so my Dutch family speaks English perfectly fine. So that also doesn't really provide an incentive. So the only real incentive there is for me to speak Polish, since part of her family doesn't speak English or Dutch or anything else that I speak.
It's all for Uncle Marek, or
Uncle Marek.
It's all for the family.
All for the family. Yeah. We'll see if that changes. We made the decision also to stay in Netherlands and not in Poland, so that also means you don't have an incentive on that front. So all in all, we are playing around with it. I think that's a long story short.
All right. Well, exciting, but I can definitely as like one actionable thing, just like get a Disney Plus membership and then find something in the language you want to do, and then that's something that doesn't feel like a chore.
That's basically a good one. That's a good one. And I also like the Michel Thomas method that you laid out. Sounds interesting.
Yes, and Michel Thomas, it might. I mean, that there's some issues with it, but it just has such a big space in my heart, because that was I went from like in high school hating studying languages, and I just had like one sort of moment of epiphany. I have no idea how it happened, where I just realized that I'm hating language class. I'm not doing very well, but I should want to learn Spanish. Like, it's cool to speak Spanish. Why does this feel like like it sucks so much? And then I just, started doing a bit of research as to like how to learn a language by yourself. And then I found this Michel Thomas thing, and that's the first thing I tried. And, that completely changed my whole approach to language learning. And the most important thing, it just gave me a taste of actually being able to do it. Which school had never given. I mean, I kind of feel like I'm 90% serious that I think we should remove second language education from the schools, and that would be good, because at least you're not teaching kids that they can't learn languages and that they find it boring. So then at least they can experience finding it on their own later on. Because now going through school, most kids, they're just being given data points that they are, quote unquote, not language people. And you're getting a very sort of negative experience. So Michel Thomas with me was like a 100% positive experience, and I've been a bit of an evangelist ever since.
What is the weirdest sentence you can give me in Spanish?
In Spanish?
Mm-hmm.
The weirdest sentence I can give you in Spanish. Goodness, oh, Dios mío, cabrón. El gato está fuera de mi casa. I'm just looking at my cat who's standing outside my window.
It's cold at home, or what is it?
Oh, it's getting on. Es un poquito frío right now.
Okay. What was it?
Oh no, that was my cat's outside my window.
Oh, the cat's outside your window.
Outside,
Okay.
My favorite word in Spanish is indudablemente.
Indudablemente. Okay.
Indudablemente. Indubitably.
Indubitably.
That's a word we should use more often.
Beautiful. I think there's just one sentence I know in Spanish.
All right. Is it something about where is the library or something? No.
No. No, that's way too complex. So my sentence will be, ¿Quieres salsa de ajo?
Okay. Do I want to what, sir? What did you say? ¿Quieres salsa de ajo? No.
¿Quieres salsa de ajo?
Oh, okay. Yes, I would love some garlic sauce. Thank you.
Exactly.
You find yourself in situations where that's useful quite often.
I love garlic sauce. No, my aunt, one of my how do you call that? If it's not your blood family, but if it's married into the family. Anyway, my aunt, who was married back then to my uncle, came from Honduras, where they speak Spanish. So that was one of the first sentences that she taught me back in the day, and I was like, I don't know, 11 or 12 years old or something like that, maybe even younger. I thought it was quite funny. I was going around asking everybody for garlic sauce. Everybody. I found it hilarious.
You just get so much garlic sauce. It's great.
I got a lot of garlic sauce. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, it was really fun. All right. Let's make a small little jump here to improv. Tell me how that came about, and in this case, what should I even have in mind when we're talking about improv?
All right, brilliant. So, improvisation, basically, playing with spontaneous creation in the moment, right? Mm-hmm. And when say improvisation, some people might think about music, right? Jazz, which is all part of it, or people dancing, just making stuff up. It's all improvisation. Also, just our conversation now, right? Where we don't have a script. We're just we're making things up as we go. It's all within the realm of improvisation. Improv, more specifically, that then it's usually thinking about improvised theatre. So theatre right. Without any scripts, and that's usually then also improv comedy. Have you ever been to an improv comedy show?
I have not. Well, a long time ago, I think. I don't remember. I was a kid.
Okay. Amsterdam's got good stuff. I usually go there for festivals and stuff. Yeah. I've played quite a lot in Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. So that's what it is. And then it has a sort of pedigree going back in time. Anyone who's taken a drama class might remember some sort of basic games you've done. If that's like standing in a circle and you say a word, another person has to say a word that they associate with that, or you're zip-zapping and boinging something around in a circle, or any sort of things you call drama games. They they sort of are usually part of the sort of improv tool case that you can either then use as a way of just facilitating play among adults. And there's so much that you can learn from that, which we can get into. Or they're just ways of creating a fun comedy show on stage. That would sort of be the staged version of it. So for me, improv is what I do on stage, and I perform, I produce shows, and I teach. It's also something that has had an effect on like my life philosophy, you can say. That's the third part of improv. It's a bit like a cult in some ways. There, you can get pretty religious with this stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. What was the effect of that on your life philosophy?
Well, basically what drew me to improv was a great fear of losing control and failing, basically. And I saw a couple of shows of people who would just seem fearless. You know, they get up on stage and they just start something and you have no sort of clue what's going to happen. But it seemed like they could just sort of handle any situation that was thrown at them. So for me, I went to my first sort of improv workshop just because I wanted to challenge myself in that way. And it's, you know, it's if anyone's ever gone to a class like that, I mean, I was so nervous going in. But then, you know, you get there and that feels like a bit of a win. The next time they ask someone to step up and do something, you do that, it feels like a massive win. And then, you know, you have all these sort of moments of feelings of mastery in a way.
Do you have stage fright from your personality? Do you experience that?
From my personality, I think yes. So most people would describe me as a very extroverted person and a showman. But growing up, I was a very more sort of quiet, introspective kid, and I didn't like to take the stage. I played music growing up, but usually in like group setting, you know, marching bands, orchestras, played the trumpet. And anytime I tried to play solo, I mean, it was a terrible experience. So I was terrified of it. But so I had to sort of teach myself many of the skills of being able to stand on stage. So that's a big part of what you learn in improv is to stand there and you're basically just listening to what your partner's doing on stage and then what's happening in the audience, and knowing that anything that happens here and now, it's your job to just listen, pay attention to it, and then react in a truthful way. And when you practice that enough about just paying attention and reacting, then, I mean, you can stand in front of a crowd of people and kind of feel like you're in control by knowing that it doesn't matter what's going to happen a minute from now. It's all just about the next interaction, the next thing that happens, and that you can always just pay attention to.
Right. And practically speaking, what do you react to? Is it like the facial expressions of people? Is it their laughter? Is it the body movement? What are you looking for?
Oh, well, it's all of that, right? I mean, as far as you and the partner you're with on stage, you start with nothing. It's a bit of a creation moment, like, you know, let there be light. Boom, you have a stage. Anything can happen. And then you can just observe what the other person is. You can even look at the other person. They don't know they're doing something, but you see something in their body, and you might just make a statement, right? So you can say that they look sad, or whatever. And now that person, they've been given information as to the reality of the situation, what is happening. And then that gives them something to work with, so they're building on it. And then so it's sort of, you have a huge tool case of different things you can pay attention to. And that is something you would practice when you learn these things. So in the beginning, people like to get very wordy. They want to be verbally, verbally clever. But a lot of it is also about just the silence, like you say, looking at someone's body language, something that can give you a tremendous amount of information.
So there's a couple of things that are coming to mind right now, because what you're talking about to me doesn't just seem like presenting and improv skills. It seems to me like communication skills. If you are, for example, in a negotiation with someone, it is also very important to look at their facial expressions, their body movement. You need to look for things as silence. Are people comfortable with sitting in silence and taking the time to think about something? Things like that. And then instead of focusing in your mind on the next thing that you're gonna say, really focus on the other person to determine how you should say the next thing that you are gonna say, or not. If you determine that the best thing to do is just to be quiet and to listen and to give the space for the other person to step into it. Does this make any sense? Do you see also a parallel between those two? And do you think these skills are necessarily, let's call them improv skills, or where did you pick up these skills during improv, or is this more like your intrinsic interest that brought you into having good conversations with people and having good interactions with people? Where did that specific skill set come from in your case?
Well, for me, it's a skill set that I've definitely developed on many different fronts. But it's exactly right what you're saying, that this is these are basic social skills, or advanced social skills, you could say, in a negotiation situation. So many people who come to an improv workshop, they're not necessarily there because they want to create great theater on stage. They might just want to feel less awkward in a party. So they want to learn, how can I, so it's basically about how to play well with other people. I'd say that's maybe the most straightforward thing. And just like you said, right, where it's, instead of focusing on yourself, it's about focusing on another person. That's the first step you would teach someone who's way too self-conscious. People who go to a party and think, how am I going to hold my hands? How am I going to start a conversation? What am I going to say? Then you give people very practical tools as to how to just make observations. You're listening to what someone says, how to build on that. Easy things like when you're making a joke, you want to have a callback to something someone else said, right? So that's basically how, the comedy sketch will evolve. Everything that's been said is relevant. If you can pull things back, then you're showing that you were listening. So all those things you practice very, very specifically. So in an improv class, I've taught a lot of classes over the years, and you get all kinds of people, but you have two, person A and B, who are very typical. One is usually the guy who's a very extroverted, used to be the funny guy, used to people telling him, hey, you should do comedy. You're hilarious. And this person is there to show how funny they are, and they want to get laughs. They're chasing laughs, and they're usually, you can see it in their eyes, they're thinking about, what's the next thing I'm going to do? And with those people, you need to quickly sort of break that down, because if they're just focused on the next laugh they can get, then they're not opening themselves up to see how you can discover a story together with someone else that's, better than what the two people could create by themselves, which is everything it's about. It's about discovering stories, collaboratively. So everyone's being surprised. But then you have the other person who is this usually quite awkward, socially shy person, doesn't want to take up a lot of space. So then you need to teach them how to grab a bit more of that space. But funnily enough, it's usually the more quiet, introverted person who becomes the better improviser, the person you can put on stage and they will actually be part of scenes that are a lot more, well, satisfying to watch, because they're so much more focused on making the other person look good. They're listening to things. They're finding out what the scene needs, rather than this is my big laugh moment that's coming up.
So the introverted person is more looking outwards to make the environment look better, and the extroverted person is primarily concerned with being funny.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all about just taking things very slowly, so step by step. So you're basically, I like to think of improvisation as you're walking backwards into the future. So basically, you have no idea what's coming in the future. You're blind to that. But as you take one step back into the room, then a bit more of the room in front of you will emerge. So that's what has been established. So someone said something, said who you were, etc. And those things that have already been established, they want to be in view. And you want to remember them, have them in view, keep referencing back to them as you're taking one step back. And the further back you get, the bigger the room you've established. But you still just need to take that one step at a time. So it's all this, you're sort of ritualizing, creating some specific tools to deal with balancing on that edge between chaos and order, right? So you want to jump out into the unknown, and then you want to bring it back, and then you're making something out of it.
I think you're generally making a good case for why improv is good, not just to do a show, but also to just become a better playing partner in your social interactions, wherever those may play out. And that makes perfect sense. So for anybody who's listening, who thinks to him or herself, like, hey, I can hone my social skills, or I want to hone my social skills in order to become a better playing partner to the person or persons I'm interacting with. Let's say that we take improv as a good opportunity to investigate. What should that person expect in terms of how hard is it going to be for the person? How long is it going to take before those basic skills are there? Could you try to break that down?
How hard it's going to be for a person, I think would vary from very much from individual to individual, but definitely to go in. You need to be aware that if it doesn't feel like if it doesn't hurt, you're not doing it right. If you feel too safe, then it's a sign that you're not pushing yourself far enough. Because it is that dance between you're dancing around your comfort zone, basically. And some people feel more safe in ambiguity and uncertainty and the spotlight. And for those people, they need to find ways of, or they will then be introduced to ways to push themselves even further. So if you do like a 5-day intensive course with people who know what they're doing, that's enough to go from being, never having been on stage, afraid to open your mouth, to basically playing small scenes with people that make sense and are funny and feel like you're right where you should be. So I mean, you can learn so much in a very, very short period of time by going to, basically taking some classes. Most large cities would have people who do improv. A bit of a problem, or which I think is an issue, is some of these improv communities can be quite closed in the way they are. It's a typical place where you would go and many people assume that everyone thinks the same way. So you have, I don't like to use the word woke because I don't think anyone calls themselves that anymore. But people who are of a specific idea of what it means to take care of people and be a nice person, etc. A lot of improv communities are heavily skewed in that way. So then a lot of improv communities now have basically turned into a large focus on being psychological safe spaces.
Right. So a lot of topics are off limits or something like that.
Exactly.
Offensive,
a lot of
those
topics,
kind of things.
Yeah. And that is a bit of an issue for me, because the thing that I found so exciting with improv was the fact that it was training you to be brave in the face of danger and uncertainty, rather than saying, so it's providing what you could say a playground, right? It's providing a certain space and rules within which you can, play safely. But the reason you've got those support wheels on is to, train you for the real deal of going into when you can't control the situation and when you actually need to be brave.
Right.
Yeah. So I've noticed that sometimes they seem to sort of skip that, and it's rather just a place to play and never teach you to be brave, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think so. If we distill this down into a practical tip, because it makes perfect sense that if you want to go to an improv class, you need to do actual improvisation, and improvisation means potentially doing things that might be offensive, or because comedy in general in a lot of situations are it's on the line of being offensive, and that's why most of the time it's funny. At least that's how I see it. And there's certainly a couple of comedians in the Netherlands that I can think of that thread that line. So if you distill this into a practical tip, could you say something like, okay, if you are looking for an improvisation class because you have determined that what you can learn there is of value to you for whatever reason, be aware of these kind of things. And these kind of things in this situation might be something along the lines of limitations on what you can say or what you can joke about.
Yes, that is, all that was well put. And that is a danger, some limitations like that, and a bit too much political correctness, and the typical irony of being in a space. I mean, now, because I also sort of assume that I'm speaking to many people who have chosen to be on Peterson Academy, for example, that you might end up places where people assume that everyone thinks the same way, which is also ironic, considering it's supposed to be there to encompass everything, to be open for everyone,
And we've certainly experienced that.
Yes, indeed. But I've navigated that by, most, I'd say, fun comedy you can do without having to reference any kind of things that could be taken as political or overly sort of ideological. So you can always, the better you are, the more you can play to that which is just sort of truly human, that basically everyone that can resonate with everyone. And yeah, the more people start just doing jokes that are making fun of certain kinds of people, or very sort of inside baseball jokes, then they're just not very sophisticated. But I think to people who have a more conservative bent to them, I think those people would never go to an improv class. That's a bold generalization now. But I think there is something for me philosophically. I rationalize my way into something which you might call a bit more sort of conservative ideas, tendencies, which came from a respect for, tradition as a sort of example of something that has evolved over time, right? And also same thing with you can talk about. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. You're cutting out
a
couple of times already. Yeah.
All right, yeah, because it was something with my screen here. But yeah, the conservative the case for conservatives when it comes to improv, I would say it's teaching you, it's showing you on stage how things can or spontaneous order, right? From the idea of more, you could say, sort of Hayekian economics, right, which comes a bit from the right wing of the free market as a process that no one has. It's not a product of human design, but of human action. So people acting in the moment over time, and it's then evolved. So that's kind of what you're seeing with stories on stage, that no one's really controlling them, but they are spontaneously ending up being meaningful, and therefore also you end up walking down these patterns of archetypes and themes you find in ancient stories. Because that is what is meaningful for the people on stage in the moment, and also it's what resonates with the people in the audience as well. So I think you can really make this sort of traditionalist, sort of a free market case for improv theater, which is at least one of the ways I came into all of those things, that at some point in my life, they all just sort of made sense at the same time and were all reinforced by each other. Which is also why this term, which has become popular, in these Petersonian circles, the spirit of play, right? Which keeps popping up everywhere, which is something like, that's something I've been meditating on now for a long time, and it just keeps popping up, and it just seems so correct in a way. I don't know exactly what it is, but that's sort of my life's work at the moment, is to explore everything that intersects around the idea of play, in a way.
If you would be talking to Peterson right now, he will definitely bring up the burning bush.
Exactly. Well, right? And because that's the thing, you're on stage and for some reason something catches your attention, and then you tend to it. And that's exactly what happens in an improv scene. Someone's doing something, and then it's your job to say, ooh, this is something. And then the audience, they're looking the same way. They're saying, ooh, something happened here. And then you're focusing in. So yeah, that's one of my goals, is to sit Peterson down and talk about improv. Get him up on stage.
The conversation. Yeah. I do think it's right though. The whole spirit of the whole spirit of play. And I think it's also the opposite of, what did he say? It's the opposite of authoritarian dictatorship. In the sense of everything is controlled, there's no freedom whatsoever. Everybody, there's no play anymore, because everything that you do that is out of line pretty much is punishable. The complete opposite of that is play, which is the optimal state of people to be in order to go on adventure and to learn and to grow and to build and to help each other reach the most valuable ends that they can reach. I believe that's, I'm probably butchering it right now, but that's, for as far as I understand it, the primary spirit of what play means.
Yeah, I agree completely. And we're all trying to find different ways of wording this, right? And representing it. But it's something about what you do voluntarily for its own sake. It seems meaningful, and the fact that there's laughter involved has to be important somehow. So there's something about the comedy aspect which is slightly sacred. Being in a room where everyone at the same time, for the same reason that they can't necessarily put a finger on, erupt into involuntary noise. It's great.
I can already hear Peterson right now in the back of my head, and he will say something like, along the lines of, that spontaneous laughing cannot be faked. And
exactly,
because it's deeper than you thinking about it. You are laughing before you are actually consciously thinking about it. So laughing as this primordial instinct to a specific situation that makes itself manifest. He will probably say something along the lines of, that is the spirit at play. Yeah.
And that can be just one pitch, I'd say, for why people should explore taking an improv class or something, because it's for many adults who otherwise find it hard to, you know, schedule doing things, it's 1 hour where you meet up with other people of, you know, adults, and you just have structured play for 1 hour, and you're just laughing. I mean, it's insane the amount of just joy there is in a room with adults doing what might just look like, you know, silly children's games, but it's a wonderful thing, and it shouldn't be it shouldn't be something that is only associated with like one group of people or ideology or something like that. I mean, this is something that's just so basic, and yeah, we need more of it.
Have you ever seen The Office?
I have, of course.
So
then
I will
stuff.
ask you. I will ask you one question then about improv classes. How often do you encounter Michael Scarns?
Michael Scott?
No, Scarns, the FBI agents, his persona.
Oh, that's it. Okay, yeah, the guy who pulls out the gun all the time. Is that the one?
Yes, that's it.
Does. Yeah, it does. It does happen, and that is it's the first thing that happens to someone who is in a scene, and they freeze, and they feel like they're losing control, and they don't know what to do. What they do is they either kill their partner or they kill themselves. The amount of people who are in the middle of a scene where they're like doing taxes or something, and then all of a sudden they pull out a gun and shoot themselves. I mean, that happens. That happens a lot. Yeah.
How if something like that happens, how do you, as somebody who teaches improv, how do you deal with that? What tips would you give that person? Let's call him Michael for now. What tips would you give Michael?
The most basic thing you would do is just to say it's not allowed to kill anyone in this scene. You need to find a reasonable reason to leave. Or you do the other one, which is you just continue the scene, and now they're in hell, and they're in the afterlife.
Wait, what? In hell? How does that work?
Yeah. Well, if they just killed themselves with a gun, then you continue the scene in hell, and you tell them that you can't escape.
Oh.
You need to follow this through.
That is smart. That's
Yeah.
cool. How does that work? So what happens then?
Well, then, I mean, what's funny is the first thing. Sometimes they go through many levels of hell. I mean, they kill themselves in many levels. But then
go
all of
through
a sudden,
all 7 layers.
Yeah. But then all of a sudden, you've got yourself a good joke, and it goes from them being escaping to it being like, oh, we see a pattern going on here, and I thought I was lost, but now it's a game of how deep into hell can I kill myself. Yeah.
All the way down to pride.
Yep, and they're that's where many of them are.
Michael Scarn, all the way
Michael
down to the
Scarn.
level of pride. Yeah, nice. Oh, that's good. That's good. All right.
All right. Well, Jeffrey, I hope you've been inspired to take some Polish improv classes.
Polish improv classes. That might be interesting, actually.
Yeah.
I might actually Google that. Some
Hey,
improv classes here in the neighborhood.
I know some brilliant Polish improvisers. They're
Really?
like world class. Yeah. There's one group. They're called Impromowomi Swami or something. I'm butchering the
Yeah,
Polish
yeah.
here.
One of those
They
weird
do
words.
improvised musicals, which also happens to be my main thing, and they're like brilliant. Yeah, I think they're based in Krakow or something.
Okay. Well, I haven't been in Poland for quite a bit, actually, for I think 3-4 years, but I've went there, I don't know, 10-15 times, something like that. Send me the name. I'll check them out. Might be interesting. Do they have
we'll
online material or something like that?
I think they do. Mostly on Instagram or something.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, I do have a couple of last fun ones for you before we end up, if that's okay with you.
All right, let's do a couple of quick fun ones.
All right. I do have a philosophical one at first, though. So, looking back on your journey from growing up on a sailing ship to being who you are today, what are some of the lessons that you took along the way that you feel are very valuable to share and to shout out.
Shout out that if you're not having fun, you're doing something wrong. I think that's all about it. It's all about somehow finding the play. Don't plan ahead too far. I've done a lot of trying to fix my life far into the future, and I realized that Magnus today has got no business planning for Magnus 3 years from now. You've no idea what that guy is going to be like.
On that front, you and I are complete opposites. I am the guy that plans years in advance.
Oh, well, we'll fix that. We'll fix that.
We'll fix that, yeah. Yeah, maybe. All right.
I'm pleased with those. They take up a lot of my time.
Beautiful. All right, Magnus. Is there anything else that you would like to mention?
I would like to. Just that I'm excited to keep seeing where this community on Peterson Academy is going. Also, keeping an eye on what you're getting up to here, and I need to go and pack because I'm flying to China tomorrow.
Oh,
for 2 weeks filming travel content.
Travel content.
Because I am experimenting with basically being a bit of a Chinese influencer at the moment. It's a very weird little project. But again, I'm trying to do it in the spirit of playful adventure here and just see what happens. And it's so more on that to come.
Anywhere that we can keep an eye on that, like a channel, YouTube channel or something, or
this is purely on Chinese social media at the moment. But I'll be putting up updates as to what I'm doing on YouTube and Substack, stuff like that. So sharing what I'm learning from trying to playful language learning. That's sort of the name of my project at the moment.
Beautiful. If it's already reachable, I'll make sure to put it in the description as well, so people can find you there. Yeah, beautiful. Awesome, Magnus. Great talking to you. It was really fun.
Likewise, Jeffrey. This was great. Nice to hear your voice even more. You have such a nice podcast voice. you should know that. And
I don't know how to react to that.
No, just take it. Just
really
take
don't.
it, man. Yeah, I'll just leave that with you.
Appreciate it.
All right, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, you too, man. Thank you. Take care and have a good trip.
Okay. Thank you very much. See you later.
Take care. And with that, Magnus has left the conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or following the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. And before I leave you, let me share with you a quote that is generally credited to Mark Twain. 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did do. So throw off your bowlines, sail away from the safe harbor, catch the trade winds in your sails. Explore, dream, discover. Thank you for listening, and take care.